Hello and most welcome to the lecture 743, sorry that slip of the tongue. Well, we had a discussion earlier on about relaxing the tongue, and I think that is what I did. Or it's this most interesting new aspect I just found out here, and that's a new take on what one could say the advantages and also the disadvantages of the Enlightenment and its discoveries. We used to have, that was the part of lecture 741, I think it was, about scientific revolution. And today I also take inspiration from this book, The Scientific Revolution by Lawrence M. Principe. He's a professor at the Institution for Technology and Science at Johns Hopkins in the USA. We used to have a sort of knowledge that was most holistic and global, and where all aspects was taken together. There were no difference between effective cause, material cause, productive cause, and final cause. They concluded into the same theory, and therefore you didn't have to add anything. You didn't have religion and science, you didn't have religion, science, and art. It was all part of the same. It was just having different causes. And it's fair to say that the Aristotelian knowledge base was, especially when it came to the effective and the final causes, defining objects by objects to other objects. So all context had a final cause. So if you had knowledge, there was always a final cause. Therefore, teleology was included in how knowledge was sort of produced, or how it was formulated by the foundation. So it was not something that we added on. That is actually the case today. If you go to a congregation or a church, you will have the scientific worldview where there is no teleology, there is no material cause, there is no effective cause. And then you come to the church and they will put something extra into the whole do. And they're going to say, although all of reality, everything you do, everything you actually work with, it's not completely true. Here we have a special worldview, and this worldview actually has some sort of teleology. And this is nothing new. That was pointed out by many people. Jean-Paul Sartre called that people not listening to the voice of reality are liars, not only to them, to their kin, but also to themselves. And it's inexcusable to lie to in itself. And we heard earlier on some Joel, I was called, said was intellectual dishonesty. And that sort of always interested me. Why do we have this sort of problem today that we didn't have before? And that is actually because something positive happened in this period. And that was the technological revolution. And what did that do to humankind? Well, all of a sudden, we managed to get a new tool. We got rationality. And in this aspect, what was previously called nature philosophy or philosophy of nature was rather turning into the natural sciences. And everything became more and more specialized here. And the only thing that remained of the different causes, the four ones, was actually the material cause. Nothing was any longer exposed to be or expounded to be other than material cause. There was no effective cause. Effective cause would be why something was made, for what purpose. There were no final cause, that's the teleological cause. They tended to back off a little bit. And in the end, I think that was the last thing that disappeared. Maybe late 18th century, and that was the effective cause. Because when we constructed the material cause, the effective cause, and the teleological final cause by itself, it sort of naturally disappeared from vision. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, I think you have to maybe turn it a bit up. No, let's see here. This, I think you need to do. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, when you do a differential calculus, the final cause and the teleological cause becomes evident from the beginning. At the same time you do a calculation, it's already clear. And this is really interesting. What we used to be the case, I had an example earlier on, I don't know if you remember that one, but it was about the cart, and it has like sort of a wooden thing. And I tried to explain that you could calculate on this wooden part. Before, you had to try it out and see what size it could be. You didn't know from the beginning if it would hold or not. That could only time tell and practice. And those two things, practice and your skill, that took time, but that was changed into calculus. So I could sit by the table and calculate, and I could say directly, this will suffice. For instance, a piece of wood made from oak doesn't have to be more than 1 foot of breadth. And that would be enough. And maybe I could even say, this is going to last you 3 years. Do you see now? You don't no longer need time. Already when I'm sitting in this instant, I can calculate what is going to happen in the future. Do you see how the final cause disappears here? There is no need for a final cause. It's a little bit, you no longer have to walk the path to see where it's leading. I had that example before when we spoke about theology. Sorry, it shouldn't be theology. And we also spoke about that when we talked about the wanderer in Heidegger. That poem from Fichte, I think it was, when he was wandering home over the mountain. And the walk is very important in that tale. And all of a sudden, now I can calculate, and I know immediately the final cause, long before it's happened. That gives a very physical, embodied impression that the final cause is no longer important, because the calculation shows that. It's already finished, clear from the start. And imagine now that you are a little bit not firmly on the ground. You do not walk the path. You're not a practical person. I think Voltaire could be a good example there. He would think that reality is already, in some sense, finished, ready. The future is already here. And that's the impression that the calculus can give you, could give you. That's very important. And this is an interesting aspect, because by this time people start to say that the future is already here. You didn't have to walk any path anymore. And there is a double take here. One thing is you didn't have to do the job to walk or do the thing or try out this wooden thing, the oak piece of oak. You didn't have to try it out 2 years. It was no longer a knowledge hardly earned. Hard work earned knowledge. It was knowledge all of a sudden. That's one aspect. The other aspect is the impression it gives also. It gives the impression of instantaneous, like instant coffee. You get it directly. And that could be something that sort of dominates your bodily perception of reality. Maybe even more so if you don't do the calculation yourself. I don't know. But looking from the outside, and I said this the last time, it was like 50 lectures ago. In the beginning of the calculus, people actually thought it was magic. So we gotten used to this. Nobody would say, there's a couple of industries over there. You wouldn't knock on the door and said, oh, what you're doing here is magic. That would actually happen in the early 18th century for a good reason, because you have to remember this had never happened before. No wonder people get amazed. And for you to really understand that, you need to get into that emotion of wonder for the technical revolution. You need this emotion to really understand the force of this perception / practicality, the instantaneity of knowledge. Because it's both ways. Partly you don't have to do the job, the work anymore, and partly it's the impression it gives. And I think these two factors are working side by side, doing slightly different things. But it became an idea in the 18th century. The future is already here. I don't know if you heard that one. It became popular during the French Revolution. The future is here. And that's the nascent modernity that starting, the first seed of modernity. We usually say that modernity comes later, but I would say this is the nascent modernity. It starts here. And of course, as a person, you can sometimes, with the calculations, even today, feel rather amazed with what you can do. It is nothing short of miraculous. And you have to remember, if I were as an engineer to be sent back in time to the Roman era, my knowledge of technology and my calculus would make me into, I don't know, something of a second coming of Messiah or something. Because I would be able to do things they couldn't perceive to be possible. And neither would they be able to understand it easily. Maybe in the Roman time, few people, mathematicians, philosophers, but I'm not sure, because I learned these things from a very, very early age. We already have it in primary. You go to 5th or 6th class, you get those things that were unconceivable 500 years ago. That needs to be put into the head, the amazement, because then it will be easier to understand how people got so convinced, got an embodied convincement that final cause is no longer necessary and material cause slowly disappearing, effective cause is not so important anymore, and you end up with only one cause. And that's I would say, then you are well into the Enlightenment, maybe even into the 19th century. But these strong force need to be accounted for. And this is still alive today, but well, it's even more alive today. Let me just give an example here. There was big debate last year, in the beginning of the year, between two great philosophers of this day and age. One was Alvin Plantinga, and the other one was Daniel Dennett. Even if I don't appreciate Daniel Dennett that much, but he's highly intelligent. There's no reason to think anything else. They were discussing, and for some reason, Daniel Dennett didn't had anything to say. So instead of arguing against the argument of Alvin Plantinga, he just said that if we were to follow that path, we wouldn't have any more surgeons that were effective. And that argument goes directly back to Enlightenment, and especially after Enlightenment, where the idea that you are strictly rational also means, by that time, that if you even imply that there is a final cause, that should be rejected already on a gut feeling. Isn't that interesting? The gut feeling should be rejected directly. And this is an example only of the strength of this conviction, this bodily conviction. That's, I don't make an argument if it's true or not. I just want to try to show to you how strong this conviction is. Otherwise, Daniel Dennett wouldn't be able to say that. And actually in this debate, I would say the majority actually agreed with Daniel Dennett. But there were some people who said, that's too emotional. But I would like to take a look at the emotional argument here, because emotions are strong. They are always founded in something we experienced, and they are very hard to debate with. They are impossible to debate with. If you argue with somebody and that person is emotionally or perceptually convinced something is different, that person might actually in the end say, oh yes, I agree with you. But it doesn't matter, because once you perceive the calculus, you believe in that. And I say there's no voice in this world that can convince you otherwise. But I will give it a try. And there is actually a philosopher live today, live and kicking, and his name is John Vervaeke. And what he looked at is what I would call the backside of enlightenment. And that is the knowledge we gain during the enlightenment. He has backside. And that backside is something, it's not like the effect of a medicine you take, where the secondary effect is, you don't have a choice, it will come there anyway. It's not like that, but it could as easily happen because it's so convincing, very convincing, and it's a bit unlike anything else we stumbled upon. It's very hard to define what it is. This is why I went to such great length to actually explain the emotional convincement, because that's enormously important. Because when your body knows something, it could actually be that your head thinks something else, but it doesn't matter. Try to get into that. And I would actually think that is one of the causes we don't feel embodied anymore. Because our head does not want to accept what the body knows. Because if you do the calculus, there is no final cause. This is what your body learned. And I will go so far to say that we have to retain our bodies. It's never ever going to be enough to just put up arguments. That's not sufficient. We need both. And that's because the calculus is not an ideology, it's a tool. It's not something you believe in, it's something you see working. And well, we talked about miracles before. Miracles can actually have the effect of convincing. Here we have miracles that are happening every day. That's what happened in the 18th century. And if you see them and you even get used to them, there's nothing that can beat that. I thought. Now I think otherwise. If you get a body on it, it will change. But let me instead start with John Vervaeke. What is the backside of enlightenment? Well, it's this figure. I tried before to draw a bear, and I succeeded actually when I draw something different. And this thing is very hard to draw, but I gave it a try. It look like this maybe, and it has this. It has a body as well, but there's no room to draw it.
Is it John Searle?
Yes, in a way. Yes, it is actually in a way. It is actually John Searle. I think that was a lucky guess. In a way, it's John Searle. It's this brain in the vat. But that is something John Vervaeke doesn't call brain in the vat, because it can be called different things. He calls it something that turns up on cinema for the first time in the 1920s. No, 1932. And here's a line from that. It was a speaking movie. I thought that beauty alone would satisfy, but the soul is gone. I can't bear those empty staring eyes. Those are the empty eyes of John Searle. So what is the matter with this beautiful creature? There she is. I think it's very hard to see on this actually. I can't make sense of it. She doesn't react much. She touches her, she doesn't respond. Her eyes are vacant, and she walks in an odd way. It's this young man who went to the Caribbeans and learned a new trait, magic. And he has this young woman, he's very in love with her. And to gain her, instead of woo her, he transforms her with magic to become a subordinate, pale-skinned corpse. This is a thing that became more and more prevalent in cinema and literature. And it's risen beyond belief. It could be said that it's now one of the most prevalent features in movies. So here it starts in 1930s, and it's advancing, but in later years, in the year 2000, it's gone up. And there are so many movies today, and so many TV series. There are book series about these people. We have some Dawn of the Dead is one of the biggest. 2004, Zombieland. And then you have with Brad Pitt, World War Z. And then we have, in the year 2015, 3 TV series. Z Nation on Netflix, iZombie on CW, and AMC's breakthrough hit The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead became the most popular TV series in the following years. Zombies are turning up everywhere.
The end is near.
Yes. And that is amazing, because they show up the apocalypse that we discussed earlier by happenstance. It's just pure chance. But they are consumerism, poverty, hunger, political dystopia, environmental degradation. One could say that zombie has assumed a heterogeneity of ugliness. No longer a simply vehicle for entertainment, it has become the basis for critical reflection and cultural self-examination, to which an increasing number of academic publications on the subject exist. And here is mentioning of at least 20 different. It is amazing how popular it became. And I even had a professor who was completely nuts about zombies. Yeah, there was actually the whole studies. On every page we got from her, there was a zombie. And the theme was zombies. And on the whiteboard, she drew zombies much better than my zombie. And to be a bit harsh, she actually acted like a zombie sometimes. And I don't think that was a chance. So what are zombies doing for us? Well, it's hard to say. They are doing something. It's one of those most pervasive figures in our culture, in the popular culture. And he wrote a book that treated that subject, Zombies in the Western Culture, a 21st Century Crisis. And what do zombies present? Well, mindlessness, ugliness, homelessness, and they are the backside of Western culture. The zeitgeist of anxiety, alienation, disconnection, and disenfranchisement. And they see a relationship between zombies and the idea of a secular apocalypse, a secular one. And just to demonstrate that zombie draws its power from being a perversion of Christian mythos of death and resurrection. And symbolic of lost Christian worldview, the zombie represents a world that can no longer explain itself, nor provide us with instruction for how to live within it. And they even invented a new word, and that's domicide. That's the destruction of home, and that's the modern crisis of meaning that zombie both represent and reflect. And we see the traits of this secular apocalypse in all subjects. Knowledge is going away in a steady pace. We know that. It disappears in culture studies, semiotics, philosophy, religious studies, eschatology, anthropology, and even psychology and sociology. And this is a sure reminder of what I myself experienced in the late 90s. And I think philosophy was one of the first victims for this rather reflection, the backside of Enlightenment. And I used to have a teacher who was deaf to knowledge personified. Instead of trying to understand anything, he wrote diagrams. And when we asked him, what is your personal view? He said, I don't have any personal views. I just represent. I never heard any human being saying anything like that, and it was shocking. And even though I didn't know what a zombie was to much extent, later when I saw these living dead people in the cinema, and I think Nation Z was the first one I saw, it actually reminded me of him, because they don't have a direction, they don't plan anything, they don't seem to have a view of themselves. They go in group, and they just reflect other people. And especially in this Return of the Living Dead, sometimes you wonder, there is a little group of living people, brilliant actors. I really like that show. It's a TV series on MWZ. It's fantastic, and it won so many prizes. But sometimes the actor says, I think so far they said it 2 times, I don't know who's the living dead, they or us. Because they don't have a purpose either. They don't have these 4 causes together, because for them there is no final cause. And there is definitely no effective cause. They're not put in that place for a specific reason, and they're not going to exit that place in a specific reason. And what do we have here? Yes, it's a definite apocalypse. But it's an apocalypse that doesn't tell us anything, and that's the point. It just ends without reflection, without thinking, without intention. And why is that? Well, in a way, these zombies and the counterparts, the human beings, are unborn. There is no effective cause for them. They're just there, like they've ever been there, without a teleology or anything like that. And they're going to exit that world in the same way. And that, I would say, is the loss of meaning. Because we discussed this the other day, the meaning is something that reflective consciousness creates. And this takes that meaning away. It's no longer there, because you don't have those 3 factors that puts together real knowledge. You have something else instead. So that's the backside of enlightenment. It doesn't matter if we try to escape it. It will never escape us. If we burn down every single increment of technology, it won't disappear. It already left its mark, because we're bitten from the apple of knowledge. It's too late. We're not only bitten, we are created by this knowledge. We live it out. We move like zombies. The movement is actually in Western culture like a zombie. It doesn't have an intention. It doesn't have a direction, because direction is always up. Instead, we have the features of zombie. Lack of posture. Lack of posture means lack of intention. Lack of intention means lack of reflection, of understanding, of knowingness. All those factors that, for instance, Bloom pointed out the death of the Western culture when it comes to the intellectual standard. The demise of academia, when it's just today a mindless repetition, the zombie talking, the zombie opening its mouth and closing it, and they only found that escaping is cobweb, nothing else. Maybe a dust of smoke or something like that from its empty heart. And I think the oddest thing about the zombies, that's why I don't like them, they're not very keen even in their evil doing. They're not particularly evil, because they're so passive. Whereas the old villain, he had an intention, he wanted to do evil, or she wanted to do evil. But the zombies doesn't even have an evil intent. In a way, they're non-evil. And this is one thing that I didn't like at all. There's no evilness in this. They're not proper characters. They're just machine-like. And from a Greek perspective, a Hellenistic perspective, they wouldn't perceive the zombies to be bad, because they have this, things are either evil or they are good. And that, I think that's division destroys the understanding of the zombies, and they let the zombies in that way, because they don't have any intention to do evil things. Whereas the good people, they don't have any intention to do good things. Intention disappears if you divide the world in good and evil. There's no intention. Why would the deed be? Everything is automatic. So, I think, however, it points to something very important. And this is something that John Verwerke is pointing to indirectly. And it's just the fact, oddly enough, these zombies are not the proper zombies, like they used to be in the Caribbean, where they were born once upon a time. These zombies are bodiless. They're pure minds walking about, because they move their bodies in this bodiless manner. I think that's the oddest thing. The original zombie was a soulless human being, but it moved along proper, like a normal person. And that was actually the depiction of the first zombie in this movie I showed you from 1932. So the zombies has turned into us. Isn't that interesting? They were not like that originally, not in the Caribbeans, not in the original movies, but they are imitating us. The zombies are actually imitating us, modern human beings. It's our walk they are walking, not another walk. And look at them. Go to a movie, whichever one, and you see they don't have any direction. And I think that I even heard that the poor actors, or how do you call them, stand-ins, who are the zombies, they actually lose their energy for weeks afterwards. It's tough on them, because they have to learn this specific dead walk. And the dead walks without an intention. And I can't imagine a proper dead person, if there would walk that way. I would say that's modern man. Modern man who lost its direction. Modern man who made everything transcendental and is no longer in the body. That's what I think about the zombie. Well, that's actually what John Verwerke thinks himself. But it's a very interesting little novel he did about the zombie. I can recommend it. I think I round up that, but it was highly interesting. And now we can add another philosopher together with, what's his name now? Zizek and the German philosopher. Let's say Gadamer. Zizek and Gadamer. I wish you a very pleasant evening. Don't look at any zombie movies tonight. This gives me enough scare to keep me awake all night to study a little bit more of this very interesting philosopher, John Verwerke. Highly recommendable. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. According to Jehovah's Witnesses, zombies are proof that we are living in the final days. The final days of the final days.
There you go. Yeah.